distant skies, firefight calls. The stakes are high, turn the flame, heroes and spies. Control fire, where strategy lies. Hear the tales, fierce and deep. Victors roar, defeated weep. We blaze a way, we don't hold back. Control fire, ready to attack.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Fire, your monthly musings on Mantic's Firefight. I'm Luke.
I'm Mike.
I'm Sam.
And this is episode 9, and we're going to be talking about gotchas, quirks, and oft-overlooked rules. Before we jump into it, let's have some from the Forge. Mike?
Well, I keep talking about my Night Stalkers. I haven't done much with them, but a lot of my Night Stalkers are actually Kings of War-ish, so I had square bases, and I've ordered a whole bunch of MDF round bases, which have arrived just after Christmas. So now I have no excuses. I have the models, I have the bases, I just got to get in there and start painting them.
Now for myself, I'm still going away on my GCPS, but I'm also doing up a little special project to augment my forces that I'll be taking down for Clash of Protocols in Canberra. So there's been a little bit of a lull over the Christmas break, but that's my focus, getting ready for Clash of Protocols.
Yeah, I'm the king of lulls. I do need to do some hobby, but I've stalled a bit trying to figure out what I want to take to Clash of Kings and Clash of Protocols, which is in 2 weeks or so. So that's getting very tight. Ironically, I probably could have painted all of the possibilities that I'm using by this point in time. I can field all the armies that I want in some fashion, but there's a few things that I'd like to play, given the 1 year event that it is. Still trying to figure out what, and then over the next 2 weeks I'll be painting.
Look, the good thing about Clash of Protocols is we're about 18 players, so I'll be,
awesome.
As far as I'm aware, that's probably one of the largest in the world that's been run for Firefight so far, but I'm happy to be corrected. If someone can tell me another tournament that's run place where they've had about 18, 19 or 20, be great.
So in this episode, the plan is to go through a few of the things that are, gotchas, quirks of the rule sets, things people might not, understand immediately how to play, those sorts of things that can, cause rulebooks to come out and be checked over during games, or that might catch players off guard, and that sort of stuff. So we'll be talking through a number of these different gotchas just in time for Clash of Protocols. So get your friends listening to this, and let's get those games nice and clean. Mike, do you want to take us away with the first one?
Sure. I think the first one I want to talk about is a completely 100% legal, but for me it always feels a little dirty, a little off. If you've got a large piece of terrain and you have a unit sitting behind it, it particularly works well with buildings. You can have a unit with your leader sticking its head out or just sitting off to the side of the building with the rest of the units being behind it, because you're drawing your line of sight and everything from the leader, so the unit will still be able to shoot, but then the unit will be receiving cover if it gets shot back. And so it looks a bit weird on the table and it feels a little gamey, but it's certainly possible within the rules to be able to do that. So it's one way for you to have a unit to have cover and be able to shoot other people still hiding there.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things because your line of sight is drawn from the leader, but their line of sight to determine cover is drawn to your whole unit. And so just putting your leader out there while hiding the rest of the unit give you clear line of sight for shooting, while cover line of sight on the way in. It is worth noting that there can be unforeseen consequences depending on how you tuck everything else away. The casualty removal rules do state that models with clear or partial line of sight get removed first. So if you've got your leader sticking out and just a couple of other models, and one of those other models is a special weapon, that special weapon could end up getting removed first, rather than one of the ones you've got tucked around behind the building. So you do need to be a little bit careful with playing with it.
This is an abstraction, right, for ease of play and speed of play. It's one of those things that it can seem quirky, it can seem a little bit off, but it's a side effect of the abstraction of being a leader-centric rule set. That said, of course, I leverage it. Why not? On the plus, on the flip side, when I'm playing against opponents that don't sort of understand this rule quite so well, I do point out to them as well, hey, why don't you just have that guy out there and you can hide everyone else and get cover. So I'm not trying to hide the fact that this is a strategy, but of course I'm going to use it if it's at my disposal.
Yeah, I guess I tend to think of the unit being the leader and everything else just being a cloud around them, and that cloud can billow and ebb and everything. The leader, from my point of view, is the focal point, and then the rest of the unit is just the cloud.
That's why when I when I move my units, before we get close enough to really be engaged in combat with each other, so certainly deployment and turn one, I'll move the leader and then I pick up a fistful of the rest of them and I just plonk them down behind the leader and say, that's my unit.
I think it's just important to note that the leader is always the last model to be removed.
100%.
Yeah, so it's just in there. So, yeah.
It's
So sort of the same as drones, but drones can be sniped where leaders can't.
100%. I will say, I think one of the common misplays I do see from new players is putting their friendly models ahead of the leader. I mean, I get the mindset that it's like it's free move. I've moved my leader up and I can get some extra inches further forward by putting these models in front. But of course, because your line of sight and range is measured from the leader, you're not actually getting any closer by putting those models up. But the enemy's line of sight and range is measured to your unit. Or you're not getting yourself closer, you're just putting your unit in easier range of their weapons and assault.
So our next topic is how multiple orders are affected per activation. So you can only benefit from one order per activation, but that usually means that while your unit is activating, it can only benefit from one order. But it can happen on other models' turns too. So for example, if there's two defensive auras that you're getting against a shooting unit, you have to choose on this activation which of those auras that unit is going to have. So I've got some examples of these. Say a commando unit uses Gora Endures when it's shooting in its activation. It can still benefit from the commando captain's aura when shot at by an enemy pinning weapon in the enemy's activation.
Because it's a separate activation.
Exactly, they're separate activations. So that's 2 orders per turn it's benefiting from, but it's only 1 per activation. A brawler captain may use closing fire to generate his aura, but if he also wants to use extreme violence in his activation, he must choose to not benefit from the closing fire effect when he uses extreme violence. Similarly, the NASA in Asterians, it can't use rapid recharge to regen the shields and then remote robotic reconstruction to regain a hit point, but it can use both orders if it chooses not to benefit from its own rapid recharge. You guys got any other examples of this sort of interaction?
It's a good point because maybe a lot of the thinking around it is 1 order per activation means I can only give 1 order per activation. But you're absolutely right. It's entirely not the case. Probably a good example for me would be in Maison Labs, the Canis Command Vehicle. That one has an aura which it can trigger and then give plus armor to any Urbana Blackwing units nearby, but it can't benefit from it itself. It only targets non-vehicle units, so you can then apply the best money can buy on it in order to give weight of fire 2 onto its laser cannon.
We did also discuss in Maison Lab episode the expendables rule as well, but that's not quite similar to what we've been talking about so far, but it's a unit that could receive an order in 2 different activations in the same round. So it's possible to get multiple applications. We talked about it in the podcast, but then it came up in the forum for the Firefight Fanatics, and there's a big discussion there, but it actually is covered in the rules.
Yeah, so, there's a few different examples that we can give like we have, but it really just boils down to be mindful of on a per activation basis, you can't have received a benefit from more than 1 order of any kind, except obviously the extra activation to go again. That's the only one that sort of doesn't fit with the rest of them.
It is worth noting you can only do 1 command order in an activation. So if you are one of those commanders that have 2 orders, you are still only able to issue 1 of those.
And only 1 faction order as well per activation.
Because oddly enough, it doesn't actually specify you can only use 1 faction order. It's just that most of the faction orders generally only last for that unit's activation. Probably the big one to call out is shock-resistant armor. That's the Enforcer one, which has sort of unofficially been errated to say this one is intended to be used during the unit's activation. It then lasts to the end of turn. So technically, you could give it shock-resistant armor and also high-velocity ammo in the same activation. It would only be able to benefit from 1 in that turn, the high-velocity ammo. And then in future activations, it could have the shock-resistant armor. Were it a command model, it could also be issuing its own command order for a total of 3 orders in that 1 activation.
Broken enforcers, I don't know.
I'll be using that.
I'm not saying it's good, I'm just saying it's possible.
No, they don't have enough commanders to get the dice to do it.
This is true.
So our next one we were going to run through is pinning versus Overwatch. This one's actually started to come up in a few of our games. We know the standard strategy of an assault army where you come in with a pinning weapon in order to put a pin marker onto a unit. You then charge in with an assault unit. There's a few reasons you do that. One is so that The unit you've just charged has a -1 in the ensuing fight, but primarily you're doing it in order to stop them having a charge reaction so they can't hit you with suppressive fire or controlled fire, come back at you with countercharge, or run away from you with evade. Overwatch makes things a little bit different, and this is actually where you can be carrying a pinned marker and still be making a charge reaction. The reason I've started to see this a little bit more is people have started using buildings a bit more and using the defensible, and so they've been having those Overwatch tokens a little more. So the way it works when you charge an Overwatch unit that is pinned, they do still get to, if they have controlled fire, they can still use controlled fire, but there is an additional -1 on their shooting, in addition to the -1 you get for just using the controlled fire order. You can use the suppressive fire order, but you don't get the additional die that you'd normally get for blazing away on each of your weapons, so the volume of shots will be reduced. You can countercharge, but there is a further -2 to hit modifier. I need to check if that's actually cumulative with the modifier for actually being pinned. I'd hate to think that jumps to -3 just so that you can strike back simultaneously. We've only ever played it that it's -2 total, but I wouldn't mind clarification on. And you can also do evade, and this is covered in the FAQ. You can still do evade absolutely normally, just noting that because you have a pin marker on you, you've got -1 for that nerve check. So it does give us those strange situations where a unit is pinned, but is still able to make a charge reaction because it's holding an Overwatch token.
Mainly buildings that will come up for, but again, if you're playing with enforcers or against enforcers, they have a lot of options for defensible units and ways to get defensible in there. So it is very important if you are commonly facing or play with enforcers. While we're talking about pinned, there's an interesting interaction with the headstrong rule, again, mainly for the people who are playing Forge Fathers in there, is a lot of people don't seem to be aware that you can actually use the headstrong rule to remove the pin if you are being assaulted. Basically means that you still can't use your charge reaction, but you're able to go into the fight, but you don't have the -1 for being pinned anymore.
Yeah,
And when they bounce off you because your armor is ridiculous, then now you are unpinned. And if you weren't activated, you're unpinned and you're not activated. So there we go.
Yeah, absolutely. You haven't lost the activation to the charge reaction.
Exactly.
It's just all to the good. I mean, I do still think it is worth pinning headstrong units before charging them, because it forces them to test the headstrong. They might fail. And even if they haven't, at least you're not getting charge reacted. But it is a slight mitigation for those headstrong units. Because it's not just the Forge Fathers, it's also your Blackwing. They're primarily headstrong as well. There is an interesting interplay with terrifying and headstrong. For those who are unfamiliar with terrifying, this is a rule which is on particularly scary beasties like the Plague Aberrations, Plague Lords, Corruptions, and on some of the Night Stalker units. Basically, they're so scary that when they charge you, you have to test nerve in order to not gain a pin marker. But the way we normally resolve this is, say there's an unpinned headstrong unit, I charge it with a terrifying unit, they fail their nerve check. Yes, they do still then get to test their headstrong in order to then remove that pin. They wouldn't then get the charge reaction. That's generally the way we've run that sequence. I haven't yet been able to wrap my head around the mind-bendingness of what would happen if I charged a pinned headstrong unit with a terrifying unit. Do they get to test their headstrong to remove the pin so I can then impose my terrifying? I imagine they then wouldn't get another headstrong roll. Do we get to play with the order there? I will say it's never come up, but I'm interested to see, because we don't have a timing diagram for this. So.
Yeah, no timing chart is one of my big criticisms of some rule systems.
Luke, did you want to chat a little bit about HVAs?
Yeah, so HVAs in vehicles and potentially small units as well can be a bit of a gotcha. So for those just tuning in, HVAs are high value assets. They're essentially Firefight's version of victory tokens that can be carried. They're in a couple of scenarios, and you gain points in those scenarios by having them attached to units. So when they're attached, they act like a drone. So it's worth everyone clearly understanding that drones count as models for a variety of rules. Not every rule, but for a variety of rules. The most important of which is capacity. If you want to put an HVA on a unit in a vehicle in Bodyguard, for example, your unit can't be at full vehicle capacity. So, for example, you can't give an HVA to a 6-model squad inside a mule. The same goes for buildings. So be warned that if you want to snatch an HVA, then take take cover in a nearby building for some defensible or to leapfrog somewhere else, that HVA can't take that unit over the capacity of the building.
I think that the thing that I've been caught out with high value assets is small units. Because the small unit rule is if your unit is equal to or under a certain size, it's -1 for them to shoot you. It's only a very small squad on the battlefield. But if you equip an HVA, that counts as a model. Suddenly that 3-unit precisely sized squad is suddenly 4 models, and they can shoot at that squad at full effect. It's interesting the way drones work is that they do count towards unit size for capacity and for small unit, but they don't count towards it for overwhelm or for determining breakpoint. So anytime you do want them to count towards unit size, they don't. Anytime you don't want them to, they do.
Yeah, I actually thought about that the other day when I was writing a VMin list, because I thought, Master Creeper, small unit stealthy, and I had one friend with him just as an extra wound. And I thought that could really work well for carrying an HVA.
Absolutely, because they're small unit 3.
Yep.
Well, while we're talking about HVAs, I wanted to call out, this one probably sits less in the oft-overlooked rules and more in the potential for gotchas. This is something to really catch out new players and really end games very fast. This is the way that if your unit is carrying a high-value asset and you lose an assault, the unit that has won the assault can claim that high-value asset for free. They don't need to wipe out the unit. They don't need to spend a short action in order to claim that HVA. All they need to do is win the combat by as little as 1 point. They claim your HVA off you. The reason I wanted to call out is Bodyguard. When you're playing the Bodyguard mission, you're walking up across the board and you're scoring for the DP you can get into enemy territory. But if you lose your Bodyguard, that is 10 points lost, and you can't score off that HVA again, they're removed from the board. That means that unit that loses one fight could end up costing you 10 points. You absolutely positively cannot let that unit be charged by a unit that could win 1 round of combat against it. Otherwise, it's an instant 10 points lost and no potential to score off that HVA. It's close to game ending.
Yeah, I agree. And to be honest, I like what it's going for with you drop the HVA when you lose, but I think it is much too swingy. That scenario means that you, like Bodyguard, that scenario, means you have to move towards the enemy, right? So you're essentially getting in range of their big riblies and the things that can charge you and probably kill you. And some factions have things that will always win combat against almost anything that they ever charge. So there's certain armies that just kind of, totally suck in Bodyguard, like GCPS. What are they going to do against Plague and Bodyguard? They're going to lose their HVA. They're either not going to score or they're going to lose their HVAs immediately. So I'd prefer it to be at least tempered by something like only if they're broken. So only if they're below half their starting strength will they drop the token. So
if they lose the fight and the unit is broken,
yes,
they lose the HVA.
Yeah, something like that would be much better.
Well, a lot less swingy.
Yes.
So, I guess if you are playing GCPS, you're absolutely going to have to look at running 2 lines and running all your bodyguards in your second line.
Yep.
Everything still needs to move forward. It just means you've got an ablative line in front of your bodyguard line.
Yeah, and you can't even really get away with the mule trick for HVAs and bodyguard against something like Plague, because you move the mule up, the corruption walks up and kills the mule. Now you're activated and pinned, have to wait till next turn. So then the corruption hits the unit, they run away, the HV is gone.
Oddly enough, one of the units which I find, or one of the factions I find, very consistently able to win at least 1 fight is Asterians. Because of their shields, they can go, I can walk into this fight knowing 4 hits are going to come out. I only need to win by 1, and I'm already walking into this fight removing 4 hits.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I just don't really like that there's essentially almost auto-lose matchups in a particular scenario.
I think the 10 points is way too high for that scenario, but we're not solutioning here. We're just pointing out the rules that we've got.
Yeah, it's a potential gotcha. Just make sure you don't get got.
Yes.
Mike, would you like to chat about another scenario, HVA?
The other scenario is of course extraction, where you have multiple HVAs on the middle of the line, and it's a race to get to those HVAs and then attach them to a unit and then try Scarpa and keep them alive for the rest of the match and score points while you have them in your control. That's what basically extraction does, but there is a number of interplay that can happen there to hopefully secure a quick win for yourself, or obviously watch charge for to make sure you don't automatically put yourself on the back foot.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is kind of the gotcha we're calling out. If the opponent has a plan for a turn 1 grab of those extraction targets and you don't, you can find it to be an immensely challenging game to then play. Because if they're particularly scouting onto the center line, onto multiple HVAs, it's just one short action to pick them up and then one short action to move 6 inches back towards their line. The HVA does slow them down so that they won't be able to get too far. But regardless, you're then fighting a game to get into enemy territory just to draw even. You don't want to let that happen to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's numerous ways to quickly beat your opponent to the point and grab it. So I guess the real key call out is that it is that short action to pick up.
Mm-hmm.
If your opponent seems to be able to get to the point really quickly, just think to plan ahead for that short action pickup. So scouts, obviously, you want to try and go first to pin them before they can pick it up, because that way they have to remove the pin marker and then pick it up and sit there looking pretty for a whole turn.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if, someone moves up ready to grab it for next turn, then you can, try and put a pin marker on them or push them back off the point so that they still have to then spend more actions to go and get it. So just plan ahead for that action that they have to take. Don't let them get it for free.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't actually mind if there were a slight adjustment to the scout rule saying that you cannot move into contact with an HVA with a scout move. You have to remain 1 inch away. It makes it just a little bit less aggressive.
Yeah, although some scouts can actually overshoot the mark and instead just sit in front of the point so that someone else can get up behind it with cover.
Then at least they would need to spend their advance move to move adjacent to the HVA and then their second action to pick it up. It means that they are at least on the center line holding it turn 1 rather than back heading towards your deployment zone turn 1.
Yes, agreed. So the next thing we're going to talk about, it's not exactly a gotcha or a overlooked rule. It's just kind of more a often found confusing point about what all the options for charging are. So those are, what are the different assault moves? What's a charge versus, hindered charge, losing line of sight before the charge, an advanced charge, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of potential modifiers, both in terms of the numerical and the timing chart. They're based on the different variables of the charge that we're going to go through. But I'd suggest a reread of the rules on page 28, and the modifier table is on page 31. So usually a charge is a sprint into combat. You get a +1 to hit unless it's hindered by terrain, which you can read what hinders and how on those pages. If you can't see the target before you charge, it counts as a hindered charge, and you get an extra -1. So this is the main gotcha here because it's effectively a -2 compared to what you would normally expect from an unhindered charge. It's also important to note that charges out of transports always count as having no line of sight, so they are hindered and get the -1 for no line of sight. Another sneaky thing you can do if you don't value the lives of your soldiers is an advanced assault. So this lets you assault with an advance or a short move, but you and your target fight simultaneously. This is a nice tactic sometimes to use because you can shoot someone and then advance into the same or different target to assault them, so you can get out more wounds from a single unit in a turn. But that is at the expense of essentially getting extra wounds back on your unit. And you can also play the gambit of something like, assaulting a unit to push it away from an unclaimed HVA, like if they scouted onto it, and then using your consolidation move onto it and use an action then to pick it up.
Can I also call out buildings as well? I think you mentioned vehicles. A charge from a vehicle always counts as having no line of sight and as being hindered. I believe that's also the case for charges from buildings, even though technically you do actually have line of sight out of a building, but for assault purposes, it counts as not having line of sight.
Unintuitive considering they can sit there and shoot out of it.
Yes. I think the thing I hear most often in relation to charge moves is that it's a hindered charge, it's a -1. I'm like, well, no. A hindered charge is actually just neutral. I just don't get the +1. But Kings of War players, hindered charge, -1. It's not quite that way in Firefight. The hindered charge, which is actually the more common kind of charge, I think almost most of the charges I'll make have to cross some kind of obstacle. In order to be an unhindered charge, you need to do a straight line point with no intervening things. It's pretty rare. In some ways, I'd actually like just the regular sprint into combat to be called the charge, and if it's a clear charge, you get a +1. In the same way, Dead Zone, you get the plus bonus for shooting for a clear shot, and that's the exception, so it's called out as a bonus. It is what it is.
It's funny, I think with the way tables are laid out, usually you do have hindered charges because of the way people lay out cover and obstacles. But I do a lot of my charges with my Marauders laterally across the table. So from side to side, because they've come out of a mule somewhere and then they're charging across the table. And I tend to find a lot less obstruction when moving laterally across the table rather than front to back.
This is in subsequent turns after they've debarked from the mule.
Yeah. So the first one, they get essentially a -2 for charging out of the mule, and then they get their unhindered charges coming across the table.
Not really a gotcha so much, but it's what I was talking about before. When we're talking about assaulting, sometimes it's worth assaulting someone's command unit if you can, even if you don't think you can beat them. But as long as you think you might be able to draw, because when they draw, they still lose and they have to back off 3 inches and they're pinned. And if they haven't been activated beforehand, they can no longer activate their orders if they're pinned. So it's a good way to stall them up, and it's also good for the bodyguard mission. If you can tie that combat, you can force them to go backwards and they're pinned, so they're not moving towards the halfway line.
Well, while we're talking about commanders, this is a rule which I think has actually caused a fair amount of confusion for people. When command protocols came out, they added some extra rules in about commanders in vehicles and buildings. Prior, you'd often have your commanders rocking around in mules and hornets, basically their little command chariots, and it was great because it extended your command bubble. It was great. But then, of course, they brought in actual command vehicles, and we started getting the Canis, the Raider, the Propagator, all these new command vehicles. And they've introduced the rule where for command orders, faction orders, and inspiring can only affect units within the same transport vehicle as the commander. So now if your commander's in a vehicle, they can only command either the vehicle that they're in, their own unit, or another unit that is in there with them. The confusion is sometimes people think that units in vehicles can't receive orders unless there is a commander in the vehicle with them. But the rule is a restriction on the commander. It's not a restriction on units in vehicles. I've seen some threads around this where I think people have got this twisted up, but that is not at all the rule. If you are a unit in a vehicle, you can be ordered by a commander who's sat next to you or by another commander who's 12 inches away.
For example, VMN charging out of a transport, getting to use the order to make it not a hindered charge.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd still get the penalty for not having line of sight.
Always the negatives on assault. I guess I lament this rule coming into effect. I played a fair bit pre-command protocols, and it didn't ever really feel like a problem. It felt like a tax on some commanders to give them the chariot to move around. Particularly GCPS, players did it a lot, and I just thought it was cool. It was fine. I didn't have any problem with it.
I mean, it actually gave a use for Hornets. That was nice.
Yeah. Actually, a commander and a Hornet was actually a pretty cool piece, to be quite honest. A commander in there. Yeah, put that bubble wherever you need it.
I guess I don't have a problem with there being a restriction on it. I just want to make sure that people aren't confused and aren't not giving orders to units in vehicles thinking that they can't because there isn't a commander in there.
Yeah, and the order thing is the one I'm most willing to accept. I think the inspiring should really still affect from outside of the vehicle, just because you don't have that many commanders. And so it really makes it almost never a thing that you want to put a commander in a vehicle, rather than it being an option that you can choose sometimes. Losing the command bubble across part of your force because it's in a vehicle is a bit of a negative.
I think it's probably less egregious on the vehicles. And if you think about buildings, though, if you then go, it's a 6-inch bubble around the building of inspiring.
Buildings shouldn't inspire outside the building. Buildings are big enough.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about buildings, Mike, did you want to break down some of the pros and cons of buildings?
Sure. Okay. So the first one is there's a couple of things when you need to, right at the beginning of the game, you need to decide upon whether a building is just a normal standard building or if it's fortified. And you also need to decide upon the capacity of each of those buildings. That should happen right at the beginning of the game. And sometimes I've seen too many games start where they kind of go, oh, what do you reckon the capacity of this is? You really should try to do that earlier on.
And whether or not it has a roof section.
Yes.
You're allowed to define that. We've done it even with similar buildings where we've gone, oh, look, let's just make this one's too tall and stuff. Let's just make that not have a roof section, or say, you can't, there's rubble up there or whatever, so that you can't capitalize on line of sight to 100% of the board.
Because aerial deployment can reach that no trouble. Aerial deployment can land on a roof section and then be height 15.
So I think that's the main thing. So buildings give cover and are defensible. We covered the rules earlier on in the podcast for both of those. The important thing to note is I've seen or heard a lot of people say that fortified buildings halve the units who can shoot. That's technically not quite correct. It's only 2 models for every 5. So
for every 5 capacity.
In the building. So every 5 capacity in the building. So that's important to note as well, because I've certainly heard it being mentioned a different way. The other one is to say units with anti-grav, we just talked about a second ago with the rooftop. They actually remove the height of 4 when they're jumping onto it. But then the building is then more classified like a hill. So you need to also have the movement to be able to move on top of that roof too. Mm-hmm. So while we get to remove the 4 for the height difference, they still need to have the forward movement to be able to get onto that particular roof.
Yeah, so units have to measure the horizontal distance across the ground and then the vertical distance up the building and then enough vertical distance to get their base onto the rooftop.
Yeah.
Anti-grav just get to ignore 4 inches of the vertical height.
With the building, you actually are measuring, as I said, we mentioned earlier, you measure your line, or not your line of sight, and your ranges from the outside of the building, not necessarily from where the leader is inside of the building.
Can I also just jump back on when you were saying 2 models for every 5 capacity as well? Because I can also see people thinking that it's 2 models out of every 5 can shoot, but it's 2 models out of every 5 capacity. So that means if it's a 20 capacity building, 8 models in the unit can shoot.
Yes.
You might have a unit of 8 models in that fortified building. All of them can shoot.
Yes. The units will go in there. Units can't leave and enter the same building in the same run. You might have heard Luke mention a number of times about leapfrogging.
Yeah.
Just the one is you can go into a different building again. You can leave one building, have an assault, and then as part of that reaction, go back into another building or assault into a different building. I've again seen a lot of people go, I can't leave and enter another building in the same run. That's technically not correct. You can't go back into the same building again. Mm-hmm. So that's a very important one as well. So you might get caught out, especially seeing if you got some large buildings, you can all of a sudden you might have a unit in your face that you weren't expecting because it just leapfrogged across from one building to another. Mm-hmm. So you do have a large building, you've got a capacity 20 building and you've got 10 model units in that building. A unit will get assaulted in that building. If the assaulting unit, the aggressive unit wins the original assault, it can then make another assault, or has to actually make a second assault against the other unit that's in the building too. And the second unit cannot make a charge reaction to that assault.
And I believe that assault's fought simultaneously. It doesn't normally come up.
The second one is simultaneous, yeah.
I think you're probably most likely to see this scenario in Take and Hold, because that's one where you want to be getting however much you can into that central building so you can take it and hold it until the end of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's good to take a bit of a look into buildings. I think they are good, but I think they can also be a trap for new players. I mean, what you're effectively doing is exchanging your unit's height and your leader's line of sight for the building's height -2 and the building's line of sight for your shooting. But you also gain the building's footprint and the building's height for people targeting you. With both shooting and assault. You do gain cover and defensible to offset this a bit. So buildings aren't really safe places where you can just park a unit and then fire out. You could actually be painting a pretty large target on your back by stepping into a building. You increase the amount of models who are able to see. I like to think of buildings as raising the stakes rather than taking shelter. I'm increasing my unit's line of sight and defense, but I'm exposing them to a greater amount of enemy fire.
Yeah, I used to use buildings a lot pre-command protocols. They were a lot better in terms of what they gave you defensively. That's been scaled back a lot because they were a little bit OP. Now I usually use them as a piece of cover. I rarely go into buildings now. The trick, obviously, is that if you're hiding behind a building and someone wants to step into the building, they get to blast at you with impunity.
Yeah, I mean, the defensible is good if you have some good charge reactions. But approach buildings wisely. And another easily overlooked building bonus, buildings also give you +1 nerve while you're in them. It's not in the building section, it's in the nerve section. It's something which just flew completely under my radar continually. I only really just recently picked that one up. But +1 nerve while you're in buildings. I don't know if it comes up terribly often because I generally won't park a broken unit in a building because I don't want to be exposing them to further fire, but maybe I should. +1 nerve.
Yeah, units in buildings get shot.
Yeah, units in buildings do get shot.
We've mentioned pre-command protocols a few times. If you did play then, do reread the building rules. You are probably playing something wrong. There's no more levels.
Yes.
It's changed quite a bit.
Yeah, I did play that wrong in I think a tournament game where I actually had a stalker unit go up level by level by level in order to reach no, you just go in and then out to the roof in the next activation.
Exactly.
You fill the whole building to a height of the building's -2 for your fire.
While we're on the topic of nerve, just in general, as we mentioned a couple of times, when taking the nerve test, it is -1 for pinned. But then there's also a -2 for being the last model in a troop or specialist unit only. So command units don't ever take can never be broken, I should say. They can be forced to take nerve tests for various reasons.
Terrifying.
Terrifying, or it burns, all those sorts of things. Yeah.
Oh, buildings would have +1 nerve against it burns.
Oh, there you go. Also, don't forget that troops and specialist units that are down to a single model is unit strength 0.
So it's important to try and remember. We've touched on it before, especially those people who like to have units of 2.
All right, we've talked about all manner of assault, but what happens if you lose and get trapped? So the trapped rule reads, any unit required to move directly away after an assault for any reason that cannot get further than 1 inch away from an enemy unit from enemy units is destroyed and removed from the table, even in the case of a draw. So it's important to understand the sequence of how losing a combat works, and it's the same applies for draws, basically. So you remove your casualties, then the loser moves away 6 inches and must end at least 1 inch away from an enemy. Note that it doesn't have to move the full 6 inches if it cannot. It moves as far as it can and stops. Right? Then the winner moves. This move can't be to within 1 inch of the loser. So you can't chase them down. If they couldn't get their full 6 inches, if they could only go 2 inches, you can't use your 3 inches to chase them down because they've moved, now you are moving, and it's as an advance action, so you have to honor the 1 inch rule.
Yeah.
That really narrows down the number of situations in which the loser can be trapped. So they have to already basically have their backs to the wall because the person chasing them down may move. It doesn't say they have to, right? So if you cannot move so that you're at least out of 1 inch of the attacker, then they go, I can't move, and you just die, right? So that's basically the only real situation where you can get completely trapped.
Yeah, it really is pretty rare. As you say, they really do need to have their backs to the wall of either a building or some blocking terrain or the edge of the board. But it's a rare situation where you'd force them back in such a way that you trap them and destroy them.
And even then, right, if they're literally 1 inch away from, well, let's say they're touching a building behind them or the edge of the board. You assault them, they lose a couple of models. Well, the leader, they could probably keep coherency and still find a way to fit in that space where they're outside of 1 inch.
I had this exact scenario happen to me where I managed to deep strike in a Black Talon Prime. I had a unit pretty close to the board edge. I was like, I might actually get some trapping in here. It rarely happens. Let's give it a go. Land, and the next turn, move in, shoot. Because I shot, they removed the casualties in such a way that it changed whenever you assault, your leader moves directly towards the closest enemy model and then move the rest in. They removed it in such a way that my leader was no longer going exactly where I thought they would be. They went off. It changed their line of retreat. What I thought was a sure trap because I shot on the way in, I robbed myself of it. They also managed to remove casualties in such a way that they gave themselves some retreat distance as well.
Yeah, I've managed to.
Rob Douglas.
I managed to trap a unit by moving some scout bikes right up behind an enemy unit, and it was I believe ciphers. So low model count. I only really beat them by I think 1 or something, and they ran away. So they couldn't recohesion in any way that they could fit in the gap, and they were destroyed.
Well, I mean, the flanking thing you did there is quite different to the trapping because the moving directly away when losing an assault, if at any point that leader touches an enemy model, the unit is removed. There is no trapping with enemy units, they're just killed. So if you can get your scout bikes in or a mule in behind, you force them to retreat and they touch an enemy model, then the unit is killed.
Yeah, so I guess just to wrap up this bit, there's really 2 major gotchas with the trapping. It's one, try not to put yourself into the situation where you're going to be trapped. Don't block your retreat by putting your backs to the wall or the edge. The other one is understanding what's not a trapped condition so that your opponent, who may be misinterpreted the rule, can't accidentally claim that you are trapped. Right? So understand the rule to know that you aren't trapped in these situations as well.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about unit interpenetration, because this is, I think, one I wanted to call out just because it seems illogical to some people, but units are free to move through friendly units as long as they can end 1 inch clear and they aren't charging. So that means you often have units walk through other units in order to open fire, as long as you end 1 inch clear with all your models in order so you can clearly differentiate which unit is which, you're entirely fine. The reason I wanted to call it out is that this includes vehicles, and it can sometimes surprise people coming from other systems that you can actually have a unit walk clear through a vehicle in order to then unleash fire. You can't charge through that vehicle, but as long as you can end 1 inch clear of the vehicle, you can absolutely move through it. It can be a bit surprising for people.
We've all seen Indiana Jones. You can totally fight on top of a tank. There's no reason you can't just walk over it.
I'd be quite amazed if a Forge Father could walk 5 inches faster. Anyway.
But I mean, I guess technically you could walk through a stern hammer if you're... Brockers probably, they've got slightly longer legs.
Well, your bikes can just...
Yeah, your bikes can go straight through a stern hammer.
Under the tracks, like where those motorbikes drive under the big trucks on the highways.
Absolutely, they just kick it sideways and...
Another one that I just want to talk about was with devastating, and devastating works. I've caught a number of people a number of times. The example in the book is for enforcer heavy support, shooting at, say, a unit of tunnel runners. Tunnel runners have 3 wounds each, so there's 2 models in the unit. And they say the heavy support unit hits with 3 of its missile launchers, doing 6 points of damage in total. Many people I've seen take away the whole tunnel runner unit, but that's not quite correct. The first missile hit would cause 2 points of damage. One of those tunnel runners would have a wound left on it. The second missile would hit, do another 2 points of damage, but it would only eliminate that one model. The remaining one would do 2 points of damage to the remaining tunnel runner, but that will survive with 1 hit point left over. I've seen that being misused incorrectly a number of times. So, yeah, don't just go, oh, I hit 3 times, devastating 2, that's 6 wounds. Not quite. You've got to make sure you check that correctly.
I think the rules even call out that for random devastating, so when it's devastating D2, etc., it recommends you roll them 1 by 1 and then apply them as you roll them to the unit, removing models as you go.
Yep.
And that just about wraps us up for this episode. To take us out, Overwatch. What's on the horizon for you guys? Sam?
Oh, I think I mentioned last time in my Overwatch I was looking forward to Mantic's 12 Days of Christmas. Well, didn't quite get the 12 days, but we did get some teasers of stuff on the horizon with some very exciting Mantic stuff. Of course, obviously looking forward to the Epic Warpath, but was super excited to be seeing that there might be some new Dreadball love coming. I think Ronnie described it as Mantic's best ever board game 100% correctly. If Dreadball is going to get some new stuff coming through, I'm super excited to see that.
Mike?
Overwatch, as I said, for me, is coming up really soon. As I said, there's Protocols in Canberra, that tournament, and that's only a couple of weeks away now, and that's been going for a fair while. I talked about that for a fair bit and starting to look ahead for other tournaments to run around the Brisbane area throughout the rest of the year. So starting to plan out 2025 on what I want to run.
Looking at one up the mountain in Toowoomba, maybe?
Yeah, so there's one, and it's just up at Toowoomba, which is about an hour and 20 minutes away from Brisbane. It depends upon what part of Brisbane you're in, I guess, but still. So that's in there as well. And, there's a few other events that I'm kind of looking at if it's in a school holiday period. We're looking at running an event then on the weekend. There's a few that's happening in May, but unfortunately that's not school holidays. So we'll see what happens then.
Is that BrizCon?
Well, there's BrizCon and there's 2 other events all happening in May on different weekends. They're all 2-day events, but none of it's on a school holiday period, and that's when my son plays sports, so I won't really be able to do anything in that period of time.
We appreciate everything you do.
And for me, Adepticon's on the horizon, and there's a firefight event scheduled for that. No, I won't be attending, but I'm keen to follow along with how that goes. And of course, as we've said multiple times, before you hear us next time, folks, the Controlled Fire team will have attended Clash of Protocols in Canberra. I'm excited, and should I take Rats or Marauders? And that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. So until next time, know when it's a trap, leapfrog those buildings, and unleash controlled fire.
Hear the tales fierce and deep, victors roar defeated, we